A Patriots Faith, Chapter 4. 11 years ago now, on Carson Lee's first day as junior senator from the great state of Alaska, he proudly walked up to the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. He entered the rotunda and looked around at the massive room. It was 96 feet in diameter, but seemed much larger to Carson at the time. The ceiling reached up 180 feet to the center of the dome. In the future, Carson often remembered that first visit and how in awe he was of that place. He would chuckle when he thought back to that first day, like an adult going back to his high school many years after graduation now and thinking it looked much smaller than he had remembered it to be. Carson was proud to be a member of the Senate. He had big plans and ambitions. He had many things he wished to accomplish in his tenure there. Now he remembered those dreams as well, how they too seemed larger and more grand in his first days than they did today. In his time as senator, he struggled with who he was and what he would need to become to be truly successful in his role there. He found it difficult for an honest man of moral conviction and a member of the United States Senate to stand inside the same pair of shoes. There were other good men there, men who had the same conviction and character that he did. However, they were too few and far between. He met such a man during his first term. Conrad Laramie was a senior senator from Mississippi. Carson met him one day in the Senate chapel. Carson would go there often to pray for direction or just to sit in quiet reflection. On one particular visit there, he walked in to find Senator Laramie on his knees in prayer. Carson took a seat in the rear of the chapel. Later, as Senator Laramie got up to leave, Carson stood up and approached him to introduce himself. Carson was unsure of the move, as Laramie was older and had been in the Senate for decades. He was an intimidating figure to Carson, a young rookie from the mountains. Still, he felt as though he needed to do it, and as it turns out, it was one of the best moves he made during his time there. Laramie and Carson ended up becoming good friends, which they remain until this day. Laramie took Carson under his wing and served as a mentor to him. Laramie was also a veteran. He served with the 5th Special Forces in the Central Highlands of Vietnam during the war there. Laramie had shared his experiences as a rookie senator when he first came to D.C. He told Carson that he found combat to be easier in some respects than being a politician. "You know, son," he told Carson, "when the enemy jumps out and starts shooting at you, you just naturally start shooting back. Even the ones that came out of the crowd, you could usually tell by the look in their eye who they were, whether they meant you harm or not. Here, it's different. Here the enemy will take you out for dinner and cocktails. They will smile to your face, while secretly behind closed doors they sharpen their daggers and plan to slide them in between your ribs." Carson took it all in. They would spend a great deal of time together in the coming years, until 4 years ago, Laramie himself retired. He explained to Carson that a position in the Senate was never meant by our founding fathers to be a lifetime career. It was meant to be a brief time of service, a duty that good men performed for the common good of the citizens of this nation. He explained that, when done right, that service was more of a burden than a privilege, although it really was meant to be both. It was Conrad Laramie who instilled those principles early on in the mind and heart of the young senator from Alaska. Senator Laramie's course in the Senate had run through its entirety after 19 years. He walked away from a very potentially lucrative position in his prime. He did so because he knew that he had accomplished all he could as an honest man. Truth be told, he started to get comfortable, complacent. He started to get used to the perks and felt the lure of the greed and corruption tugging at his back. Many senators and members of Congress had been in office for 30 years or more. Many, not all, had succumbed to that lure themselves. Conrad Laramie looked at himself in the mirror one day and realized it wouldn't be long until he could not stand the sight of who it was looking back at him. He had too much character to allow himself to go down that road, a road that would have been so easy for him to pursue. When he decided to leave the Senate, he called to tell Carson of his decision. Carson was shocked. Conrad Laramie explained his reasons to Carson and told him that he couldn't tell him exactly how, but that when his time came, each man knew for himself. The difference was, some walked away and others sprinted forward. Son, he said, in that moment you will know what you are made of. We all have our moral code, our ideas of who we are, what is right and what is wrong. But in those defining moments of our lives, we find out what we are truly made of. Greed can be a powerful weapon. It has ruined many good men. It is playing its part in the ruination of this country as well. You know what the Bible says. Man's love of money is the root of all evil. I'm paraphrasing, of course. There is nothing wrong with money. This is the greatest nation on earth, largely because of a capitalistic society. But there is a big difference between honest, hard-earned money and filthy lucre. Carson had come to respect and admire Conrad Laramie. He was one of the only people in Washington, D.C. that Carson trusted completely. He was truly a man of honor and integrity. Carson would indeed miss him. He would miss his counsel, and even more, he would miss his friendship. Although he would continue to be there to provide both going forward, it wouldn't be the same as having him there with him in the trenches. As Carson Lee sat on the marble bench in the looming grandeur of that rotunda, he was coaxed back to the present moment in time by the voice of his friend and aide. "Senator?" Paul Connor said firmly. Carson looked up at Paul, who tapped his wristwatch with his index finger. "We really must be going if we're going to make your 1:30 meeting, sir." Carson nodded and stood and walked out, following his aide to the waiting Yukon. As they drove down along the river, headed for the White House, Carson just stared out the rear window, watching the scenery melt away from beside his vehicle. As the Yukon pulled up to the west gate, the uniformed Secret Service agent at the post waved them through. Paul drove around to the side and parked in the lot there. He accompanied Carson to the checkpoint outside the entrance to the West Wing, where he and Carson parted ways. Carson went into the conference room where the meeting was to take place, while Paul went into an executive lounge to join the other waiting staffers. The meeting taking place this afternoon was of the Senate Appropriations Committee, on which Carson Lee sat. Carson still had a few months left to his term, but in his head and in his heart, he was already done. He sat, half paying attention as he gazed out the window into one of the many lavish gardens that surrounded the White House. He shook his head in disgust as he thought about all the veterans, his brothers and sisters, who struggled to get the most basic of care approved for payment at the VA hospitals. How much does it cost to maintain just one of these useless gardens? He wondered, as he watched two, what he could only assume to be full-time employees, tend to them. He closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. Playing in his mind was the endless loop of needless expense, the vast chasm of government waste spending that he had seen. Even now, as the debate labored on over meaningless appropriations on the table, most of which was unneeded. Unneeded, yet sure to pass to the next step in the approval process. He couldn't take it anymore. He'd heard enough. He'd finally and exhaustively heard and seen enough. He stood and turned and walked out of the meeting. The speaker paused for a split second, almost as if she had stumbled on the unplanned movement. Carson went and retrieved Paul and demanded to be taken home. "But, sir, you have meetings scheduled all week. Carson interrupted Paul. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I have to get out of this city. I feel like my head is going to literally explode." Paul paused for a short moment as Carson continued toward the Yukon. As the pair drove back around the city, Carson instructed Paul to make a stop at his Senate office. Once inside, he filled 3 copy paper boxes with personal belongings. He grabbed 2 and nodded for Paul to pick up the third. Yes, Carson Lee truly was done with Washington, D.C. He was done with the Senate, the political machine. As they drove south out of the Beltway, Carson made a phone call. When he was done, he told Paul to head to a small airfield in Northern Virginia. Paul was concerned, but just nodded at the instruction and said nothing. When they arrived at the airstrip, Carson pointed to a small private jet parked along outside a hangar at the far end of the field. Painted in big bold letters beside its logo on the side of the jet was the words Trans-Alaska Fuels. Yes, the jet was owned by Carson's former classmate, James Bradford Darling. When Carson called to ask for the favor of catching a ride back home on the jet, Darling jumped at the request. James Darling was courting Carson for a position with his company and welcomed the chance to endear himself to the senator. Before boarding the plane, Carson told Paul to leave the keys for the Yukon with the attendant inside the office. Then he told Paul, "You can call the office and tell the motor pool to send someone out to retrieve the car." Paul grimaced and nodded affirmatively. They boarded the plane, and 6 hours later were in Anchorage, Alaska, where James Darling had a limo waiting to drive them home.